Our last class period, we left off talking about processing through the system, and we talked about some of the ways in which we have discretionary power and how this discretionary power comes into play at various phases, either at the police, either at the prosecutor, either at the judge, or at the jury selection process, or during the jury process in general. What we wanted to do today is talk about something that's a pretty major phenomenon, and that we've seen pretty much 1 or 2 cases a week of this, is when we realize that we don't always get it right. Sometimes when we go through our very elaborate and detailed criminal justice process, we don't necessarily get the right person, okay? So what we want to do today is talk about when we tend to get it wrong with regards to miscarriage of justice, meaning that somebody spent time in prison for something that they didn't do. All right, so sometimes we go through this elaborate process and we don't get it right. I want to start this by highlighting some of the major causes before I kind of go through some of the numbers and some other intricacies, in particular surrounding what have we been doing to try to be better about not having this happen in the future, as well as what have we been doing to offer some type of compensation to folks who have been caught up in the system for an extended amount of time. Some of our major causes, the first one that I'll spend more time on than the others is eyewitness identification or misidentification. One of our biggest culprits with regards to what tends to send people to prison for crimes that they have not committed is eyewitness identifications. Eyewitness identifications have some general issues that I'll talk about. And when I teach this class, or when I teach about this particular topic to my undergrad class, I typically do an experiment. I won't do that experiment today, but typically what I would do is wherever the class has been taking place, I would have one of my colleagues. My class is about 2 hours and 45 minutes long. In the very first 5 minutes of class, I'd have one of my colleagues come into the building, typically somebody that they don't know. I may actually, in some cases, I literally stop strangers, like, hey, would you mind at 10 o'clock come in this room? And what I do is I have this person come into the classroom, and their assignment is to ask me a series of questions to engage me for 2 to 3 minutes. And sometimes I'll give them a little more guidance, but other times I'll just tell them, just ask me whatever you have to ask me to engage me for 2 to 3 minutes. So sometimes it's something like, hey, is there something else in this class next? I thought this was going to be something else in this room, yada, yada, yada. But just enough to get everybody's attention to turn and look at that person. After they leave, and this always happens in the first 5 minutes of class, after they leave, I go on and teach for the next 2 hours and 40 minutes. Then I'll tell them, my last slide will say, hey, a crime occurred in this building 2 hours and 45 minutes ago. A witness said they thought they saw the suspect come into our room for 2 to 3 minutes. Describe the person who came in 2 hours and 40 minutes ago. And you would be amazed at the variation that we get in who people saw walk in that classroom. I've had Hispanic people come in that people swore now was black or white. On the basis of the descriptions that I've gotten from some of my classes, everybody on campus is a suspect. And it points out the fact that eyewitness identifications are inherently flawed, all right? Not to say that there's, in some cases, yes, they're dead on, especially, not all of them have been incorrect and inaccurate, but a huge proportion of our wrongful convictions involve eyewitness identifications. One of the biggest issues, cross-racial identifications. We are horrible at identifying people who don't look like us, all right? I'm just going to be frank. Black people think all white people look alike, white people think all black people look alike. All right, we are horrible at identifying people who don't look like us. I've been called so many black celebrities that I look nothing like. I appreciate the Denzel references, but I'm not. We have nothing in common. Okay, so cross-racially, all right, we're not good at identifying people who don't look like us. We also know that in some cases, especially cases with victims, and depending on when police present victims with the opportunity to identify perpetrators, emotion can sometimes cloud judgment. One of my favorite books is a book called Pickin' Cotton. Pickin' Cotton is a book about a gentleman by the name, I believe his name is Ronald Cotton. He had been accused of a sexual assault against a young lady. And despite the fact that his coworkers and all these other people said, he was not where they thought he was. They basically gave him an alibi. He was picked out of a police lineup by the victim. And she was absolutely certain that this was a person who had sexually assaulted her. And so the book was called Picking Cotton. You'll understand why in a second. But eventually, DNA science comes along and proves what his colleagues and all these other folks have been saying. He didn't do it. And they became friends. They became friends and wrote a book about the ordeal. And they traveled the country talking about the flaws in eyewitness identifications, because she picked cotton out of that lineup. So their book is called Picking Cotton. But she talks about emotion was something that she wanted justice. She wanted to see someone punished for what had happened to her, and that clouded her judgment to the point that she picked him, and on her selection alone, he spent 12 years in prison. Another one is the recall of detail. Unless you are like me, which is borderline Rain Man, and you guys are old enough to get that reference. I say that in my classes sometimes, like, who's this Rain Man fellow you talk about? And that you walk around and I make mental notes of people as I pass them. I'm a people watcher. So I probably could, describe someone with a fair amount of good accuracy. But most of us aren't studying folks when we encounter them, especially when we don't think they're significant. And sometimes you may be the lone witness to whatever, and you actually recall somebody or someone that at the time that you encountered them, you didn't think they were significant. And you weren't creating this mental picture, this mental lasting image in your head sort of thing. Eyewitness identifications are also problematic because of police issues, all right? We do have some police issues as it pertains to lineup things and things of that nature, which I'll talk about in a second. But I want to give you a few pointers here. In some cases, the police may actually manipulate eyewitnesses into mistakenly believing that they saw someone that they didn't actually see. We have cases where that's taken place. We also know that other times the police will say, well, we know this person is guilty. All right? And so in their head, they're creating a scenario to where this person is basically just helping to strengthen their case. And so by that, police are basically alluding to the fact that we have A, B, C, and D other pieces of information. Your eyewitness identification is just another added factor, can sometimes coerce individuals into saying, yes, that's the person. We also know that some people will say, yes, they did it in getting a deal. All right? Some type of a sentence credit, some type of a sentence favor, often in the plea bargaining process. That sometimes comes up in snitches, or especially with when you have co-conspirators. All right? I tell my classes, if you ever engage in a crime, do it by yourself. People will turn, there's no loyalty among criminals, right? And so sometimes what you may have is, one person will literally turn on the other person, or someone else may, the police may have you on evidence of something else, but in exchange for you saying, yes, you saw this person do that, we'll drop this charge, or this will go away. Additionally, we also have problematic issues pertaining to police lineups, right? Police lineups, we have been known to come back with some tainted issues. For example, take this one here. In most cases, ideally, you'd want a lineup scenario to where everybody's somewhat close to what the actual perpetrator looks like. However, in some cases, we have had, and I'll share some of this on the next slide, we've had cases where the alleged perpetrator was African American, and the police lineup, that's the only African American. Actually identify the African American that assaulted you, and there's only one in the lineup. Well, that guy right there. So there's some issues with regards to how lineups are done. Okay, we had a center, or we have a think tank called the National Registry on Exonerations. This National Registry on Exonerations, I'll speak in greater detail about in a second, but I wanted to give you some background because we're going to use some of their statistics to talk about some problems that we have with regards to police lineups. The National Registry on Exonerations goes basically and looks at every known case of wrongful conviction, and known should be highlighted. Known means that it's been brought to the attention of the media, or in some way, shape, or fashion, we know about it. And I say that to say that there are a large number of cases that we don't know about. All right? Probably the vast majority of wrongful convictions we never actually hear about. But what we found is that we have 90 cases where the police have deliberately and intentionally tainted the lineup. When we look at those cases, there's really 4 unique patterns that pop out, 4 ways in which this particular issue tends to develop. One is in telling, meaning that police will basically taint the identifications by telling the suspect who to pick. Sometimes this is done in the context of a deal, in exchange for a reduction of charges, in exchange for ignoring something that you're quote unquote guilty of. So basically the police tell someone who to pick. We also know that displaying is an issue. With displaying, police will visually highlight someone. If I show you a lineup spread card and there's a yellow circle around one of the faces, you're trying to draw my attention to something, right? So in highlighting, we talked about how the fact that in some cases, exonerees were put in lineups in which they were the only members of their racial group. And if you happen to be the one who fits that description in terms of your racial group, guess who's going to be picked? One of my favorite, anybody ever watch Seinfeld? Used to be a Seinfeld watcher. Remember the episode when Kramer was volunteering to do police lineups? Until he got picked one day. They were asking for volunteers to stand in police lineups. I don't know why that random fact just jumped in my head, because I think in one of them he was like the only white guy. It was all these black guys and Kramer just standing there shaking. But we also have repeating. In 14% of our tainted identifications, the person who was identified or the suspect was shown multiple times. So if I show you lineup cards, if I'm showing you 5 different lineup cards, and in each lineup card is a new batch of faces, but one face stays in all 5 cards. So I'm repeatedly showing you the same face and putting it in your head to where you believe and you start to see the same person over and over again, and that becomes the suspect. In the 7% of cases, it was just flat out lying. All right, flat out lying in the sense that police will use false information to explain away discrepancies. Like if a person says, one of the cases that we used to watch in my class, Reuben Patterson, the Hurricane, the boxer that they made a movie about his life. Denzel Washington played him in the film. He was wrongfully convicted for a murder in Paterson, New Jersey. An initial police description said that it was a tall, light-skinned male with an afro, was the description. Reuben Patterson is probably 2 shades darker than me and did not have an afro, but he was the person who was arrested for that crime. In the police, part of what came out in the interrogation of the witnesses essentially coerced these witnesses into basically saying this is the person who did the crime, when clearly the description that was initially given by one of the victims did not match either of the profiles of Reuben Carter or his co-defendant, John Arness. Some other causes, eyewitness identifications is the biggest one, and that will come up again. We'll talk about that again when we talk about DNA and other cases in which eyewitness identifications have actually played a part in some of our DNA exonerations as well. Another key cause is unvalidated or improper forensic science. I tell my class that they are unfortunately victims of the CSI era, where they think that there's always evidence and we got all these fancy screens and we can touch and we can do this and we can test everything. So that's not reality. In reality, crime labs are not that sophisticated. Crime labs do not have this unending level of resources where we can test and we can do all sorts of stuff. And we have had cases where forensic scientists or folks who are quote unquote posing as forensic scientists have been known to be corrupt. One case involved a female forensic scientist in the St. Louis area who was quote unquote a hair expert, hair analysis expert, when it was essentially discovered that she was basically fudging results to bolster police cases. And roughly about 50 convictions, any case in which she had evidence from her lab played a part in it, all those cases got overturned. And if that was the main evidence against her was this hair analysis, then those people got set free. So we have had some forensic scientists who've kind of been discovered to not be as true and as ethical as we may hope they would be. Police misconduct. Police misconduct. I'm wise enough to have a few police friends who I love and trust, and I know that there are some officer friendlies in the world, but not all of them are officer friendly. We've had several cases throughout our history of police who may plant evidence. If you look into one of the cases that happened that I saw on CNN maybe about 2 or 3 years ago, was a gentleman who owned a storefront in the Philadelphia area, I believe, and he had video cameras in his storefront. And what they found was that his place had been raided and the police said they found drugs in his storefront. Well, he had all these video cameras. And so working with his attorneys, they went back through the video cameras and realized that someone came into his storefront about an hour and a half prior to and left something on the counter. And the drugs that they found in this raid were the drugs that were left on this counter. And the gentleman in this video was one of the police officers who came back an hour and a half later and raided this, raided this storefront. So there's a North Philadelphia police precinct that was notorious for that, for planting evidence on people, all right? And I tell my class and tell students all the time as well, if I leave here, like next Thursday, I go to Memphis for a trip to give a talk. If I'm stopped in some random town between here and Memphis, and a police officer pulls me over and tosses something in my back seat, it's my word versus his word in terms of who that belongs to, right? And with my profile, he's probably going to get the benefit of the doubt. So that's something that's a reality.
Wasn't there a case just recently in Baltimore where they caught him throwing cans or something in the trash?
Mm-hmm.
The police had done that?
Yep. So it happens, which is also why I love the fact that we can record everything on our cell phones now, because I keep a camera mount in my car for that sole purpose, to be able to turn the camera on and have a record of what happened.
Why are they planting evidence?
Why?
Yes.
It bolsters convictions. In terms of if I have a predisposition against a certain person, for one, or certain type of people, or I'm trying to make detective, I'm trying to make whatever, it makes it look like I'm very good and very effective at stopping people under the ruse of whatever and discovering evidence of drugs. So yeah, in some areas, I won't say all areas, but in some areas we have a strong correlation between police misconduct and supremacy behavior, white supremacy behavior. We have had police precincts where those two go hand in hand in terms of they wear uniforms at night and uniforms in the day. And use your imagination on uniforms.
What is the percentage of policemen of this kind of misconduct?
In terms of police?
Well, in terms of convictions.
Well, we don't know the exact number because with all of our convictions, right, with all of our wrongful convictions, we don't know all of them. All we know is the ones that kind of come to the surface. And so on one of my later slides, I'll show you kind of statistically, to date, and I went back and pulled these numbers to make sure I know exactly where we are. 2,111, all right, known since 1989. And so I can give you statistics on those, and that'll come up in a few slides. But police can plant evidence. Police can fabricate informants. By fabricate informant means that if I say that I see or I know someone has drugs on them, or I know someone has committed a crime, and the police go basically stop, interrogate, whatever, that person on my word, I'm an informant. I've given them some information, okay? But in some cases, the police may simply be acting on a hunch, be acting on a stereotype, be acting on a profile or whatever, and will say, well, I have an informant that told me that you were involved in X, Y, or Z, and when that informant may or may not exist. We've also seen a third way in which police misconduct comes into play is during the interrogation process, in particular as it pertains to false confessions. False confessions where individuals will say they did something that they didn't do. And in some cases, they reach that point of saying they did something they didn't do through psychological games. Police have tactics such as sleep deprivation, hunger, and they can use any number of things to get one to say they've done something that they didn't do. In other cases, it actually becomes physical. There was a police precinct in the Chicago area, for example, kind of where I'm from. George Ryan, who was a former governor of Illinois, one of his last acts of governor was he took everybody in the state of Illinois off of death row. And he reached that decision in large part because he'd commissioned a study to examine the issue of wrongful convictions in the state of Illinois. The Center for Wrongful Convictions is housed at Northwestern, and working closely with them, he commissioned a study and basically discovered that in his tenure as governor, the state of Illinois had actually exonerated more people for capital punishment, or exonerated more people from capital punishment than they'd executed. In addition, in the process of doing this investigation with this commission that he put together, they found it had several rogue police officers and several rogue police departments and just some major issues. One police department in particular was notorious for essentially brutally beating people into confessions. When they discovered that In one of the cases, I believe a gentleman had confessed to a crime, and in this confession is typed. And the only part of this confession that's written is this person's signature. And he alleged, and subsequent police officers and other people eventually, once the investigation came down, confirmed, he had been electrocuted. Electrocuted in a very, very sensitive area for a man. And I would confirm that under similar circumstances, I would have confessed to have shot John F. Kennedy, Abraham Lincoln. I shot everyone if I'd been electrocuted in the testicles. And in another case, it basically was discovered that this person had confessed to a crime that it was physically impossible for them to have committed, because at the time that the crime occurred, they were actually detained in another facility. But again, because they were beaten to this confession, that basically held up. And in some cases, some people will say, well, why would you confess to something that you didn't do? That happens all the time. We have people that take plea bargains. I'll show you in a few slides. Some of the folks that have been freed from prison by DNA science pled guilty. Pleading guilty means you said, yes, I did it. But then DNA science comes along and says, no, you didn't. And so you have to ask yourself, how does that happen? And there's a lot of ways in which that happens. I tell my class all the time, if I'm a black male, which I am, so that's not a hard stretch, but if it is 1960, 1955, I'm in Alabama. I am allegedly guilty of, or I've been charged with rape of a white female. I'm in Alabama. This is prior to Coker v. Georgia, which was in 1975, which means that I can be executed for rape. The jury of my peers in 1955 in Alabama is not a jury of my peers, right? So the odds are very good that if this case goes to trial, I will be convicted. If I'm convicted, the second the judge says guilty or the jury says guilty, I'm potentially facing the death penalty. And so given that dilemma, if a prosecutor comes to me and says, hey, plead guilty, and we'll give you life or life without parole, a plea bargain is basically taking the best deal on the table. Because if the best deal on the table is life without parole or death, life without parole is the best deal on the table. And so you'll have people that will basically take that gamble and roll that dice and will plead guilty to something that in their heart of hearts they know they didn't do.
Were any of those police officers or police departments held accountable or prosecuted?
Yes. Yes, they were. And there was another case in Atlanta within the last 7 or 8 years that involved a similar egregious offense that, the police were prosecuted and served time as well. We also have a phenomenon known as snitches. Anybody know the general cultural saying about snitches? What is it? Anybody know it? Snitches get... Somebody said it. Okay. Snitches get stitches. That's one of the sayings, right? Stitches, meaning that in prison, as in free world, all right, in certain pockets of free world, there are these cultural norms against basically telling on people. And so what happens is, in some cases, someone will be placed in a cell as part of their pretrial or whatever, and the cellmate will say, hey, this person told me details about the crime. And they may have gotten these details from an outside family member or whatever who has access to the newspaper or whatever, but will basically contact the prosecutor's office and say, hey, I got information about this crime. This person was talking to me in their cell and told me some very specific details that only the offender would know. And in some cases, this person is completely making this up, and they're basically trying to get some type of a sentence favor in their own case. So in exchange for me telling you this information, I need you to bump my Class A felony down to a Class D or basically something else to where I'm not serving or facing as much time as I was potentially looking at. Media pressure is another one. By media pressure, anytime we have these high-profile, big public crimes, we want to get those things solved. And the media can put a lot of pressure on the police to solve crimes. And sometimes what this pressure does is it ends up in us railroading someone, all right? Who all remembers the Atlanta bombing surrounding the Olympics? Now, the initial suspect of the person, we found the very first best-looking suspect and just railroaded that person. Turned out it wasn't him. But he couldn't shake that for the rest of his life. And he ended up dying very prematurely. But for a large proportion of his life, from the Olympics on, he was always looked at as the Atlanta Park bombing or the Olympic bombing, when the real culprit was found some years later. But he was railroaded, because with the world watching and us being who we are, we got to prove and show that we're very efficient in catching criminals. So with the world watching, we just, hey, security guard who had no business being in this particular area at the time, his shift should have had him over here, but he was over here, so he did it. And we railroaded that person. We also have hoax. It's another cause. And by hoax, we mean we make up crimes. We have had cases where crimes have been made up. Who all remember Susan Smith? The Susan Smith case was the young lady who was allegedly carjacked. And she said that an African-American male carjacked her at a stoplight, took her car, didn't realize that her 2 kids were strapped in the back. And so we had a nationwide manhunt for this African-American male that she gave a police sketch of. And so the whole country is looking for this person. And then about a week later, we see this same CNN coverage is showing her car being pulled out of a lake from where she pushed her car in the lake with her 2 kids strapped in their car seats in the back. But for a week, the whole country was looking for this made-up African-American male. And I talk about racial hoax a lot I have a book called Black Rage in the American Prison System. And I talk about that a lot in there because in researching, there's a researcher at the University of Maryland, Kathleen Russell, and her and I were in contact about just a lot of these different cases of like made-up crimes sometimes. One involved a police officer, female police officers at home, cleaning her revolver, did not realize that it was still loaded, shot herself in the leg. The police report said, while attempting to stop an African-American male in a traffic stop, a scuffle ensued and I was shot in the leg. In one scenario, you're kind of borderline hero, you get workman's comp. In another scenario, the captains wonder why we hire you. Right? So we have there's notorious examples of these made-up crimes. So sometimes, again, I always wonder, for example, what would have happened had we actually found someone who actually fit to a T the description that Susan Smith gave? What would have happened had we actually found somebody that fit to a T the description that she gave and found it relatively quick? The police probably wouldn't have been as pressing, because part of what made her crack was the fact that when we couldn't find someone to fit this profile, the police continued to investigate and continued to dig, and eventually she cracked. But if on the same day that she gave us this nice description, we find someone, that person may be in prison right now. Maybe dead, actually.
Dr. Noble, I wanted to ask about the uniforms earlier in your police frame. I grew up in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which was the headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan. There was one that lived down the street from me, whose son I played with growing up. I don't have the emotions of the 60s. I think a lot of this has to do with emotions. This gentleman was just as kind to me and kind to me than my cousin. So I'm asking this because this is very sensitive material.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the sensitivity of it, are your police frames, are they multicolored or are they all one color?
No, I have multicolored police frames, yeah.
I do too.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to raise that question.
The unethical prosecutor behavior plays a part in wrongful convictions. One of the biggest unethical issues involving prosecutors is the notion of turning over or suppression of evidence. All right? The prosecutor works very closely with the police. If the police gather 10 pieces of evidence and deliver 10 pieces of evidence to the prosecutor in theory is supposed to divulge all of the evidence that they have to your attorney, the defendant's attorney. But if the police brought 10 pieces, the prosecutor only gave your attorneys 8, then you have to wonder what's wrong with these 2 that didn't get passed off. If one of these 2 was a miscellaneous hair, a long blonde hair, and I'm the defendant, right? That suggests that perhaps either I had an accomplice or I wasn't there, or I'm not the defendant. And so suppression of evidence comes up, and that's a pretty common one in terms of what a lot of offenders file appeal for and file appeal on, but it's a very, very, very tough one to prove, okay? We also, ineffective legal counsel plays a part. Ineffective legal counsel having to deal with the fact that, as I mentioned before, not all attorneys are created equal. Just because someone has a law degree does not necessarily mean that they have your absolute 100% best interest and will fight to the maximum for your case. In particular, and again, I have friends who've worked as public defenders. I know public defenders, and I still say, if I'm ever convicted of a crime, I'm not calling my public defender friends. I'm calling my private attorney friends, right? And that plays a part as far as effective legal counsel. Lastly, we know that our system is very adversarial. And because it's adversarial, the scales of justice don't sit nice and balanced, all right? The deck is inherently stacked against a defender. You got to think on one side, you got the state, which has a mountain of resources. The state works in close conjunction with the police. The police and state work in close conjunction with the crime labs. Now, all of these people are stacked against you, the defendant. And if you got a public defender, it's you, the public defender, you and the public defender versus the state. And sometimes if you don't have the resources, the financial resources, to balance out that scale. I think somebody asked me a question last week about the original OJ trial. OJ had the resources to shift that scale. He could hire his own experts. He could send stuff off to be tested in different labs. He could hire all the attorneys to where he actually probably slightly tilted the scale in his favor. And that's one that money comes down to. When we think about the overall scope of the problem in terms of how many sheer cases we have that are wrongful convictions, estimating the problem is somewhat difficult in part because we don't have an official record-keeping system that tells us 100% when we got it wrong. Because you can't ask offenders. So you go to Riverbend and ask, who all is in here wrongfully convicted? You'd be amazed at how many hands go up. Everybody will tell you I didn't do it, right? We could have them on camera with their birth certificate and social security card, and they swear them down, it was not me. So we don't have a systematic way. Since 2012, roughly, we've started doing a somewhat better job of tracking it. But there's a whole lot of cases that we don't necessarily know anything about. Since 2012, what we've been basically tracking are these high-profile exonerations. Oftentimes, these are capital cases or cases involving murders. And they get handled by either the Innocence Project, the Center for Wrongful Convictions, the Equal Justice Initiative. We got a whole bunch of different groups that take on these cases kind of pro bono and will fight for people's freedom. However, we have a lot of low-profile exonerations that never reach mainstream media coverage or that we never know anything about. And so because we never know anything about them, they don't get counted in a number, as well as the ones that never actually get free or secure their freedom. So we got these low-profile ones that we don't know anything about, or the ones that never actually secure their freedom. In some cases, I will give them some credit. We have had some police officers, we've had some prosecutors who, in retrospect, have gone back and basically overturned previous cases that they worked on. When, as a police officer, as a prosecutor, you convict someone, and then 6 months later you discover some additional evidence that you didn't have at the time that you convicted them, and you go back and you right that wrong. We have had cases of when that happens. This National Registry on Exonerations is what we've had since 2012. The National Registry on Exonerations is what gives us a full picture of just how bad it has been for roughly the last 5 to 6 years. This is our best source that we use today. This is a collaborative effort between 3 different universities. It's University of California at Irvine, University of Michigan Law School, and Michigan State Law School. These 3 entities collectively had devoted resources and labor to accurately tracking and keeping up with statistics and all of the various wrongful conviction cases that we know of that have happened basically since 2012. In 2012, Northwestern was actually involved with it as well. Northwestern was one of the first, was basically the group that started and then punted it off to these other 3 places. It started out between Northwestern and the University of Michigan. What they do is looked at every known case of exoneration going back to 1989. 1989 is significant because that's when we had our very first DNA exoneration. The very first time that DNA freed someone from prison was 1989. And what they basically developed is this registry where we keep up with all of the cases and all of the details and all of the demographics and all of the statistics. As of this morning, we have 2,111 known cases of wrongful convictions. And these are the ones that, again, that reach the level of media coverage or reach the level to where they're on the radar enough to where we can count them and pull them in. However, again, there's some low-profile ones that never reach that level, and there's some folks who are still sitting in prison who just have never had their even opportunity to reach profile of any nature.
What percentage of those 2,111 are white and black?
That's the next slide. It's about to come up.
Thank you.
Some, when we break down those cases, gender-wise, 90% of them are men, 10% are women. Racially, 46% are black, 40% are white, 12% Hispanic, 2% Native American and Asian. And statistically, that is right on par roughly with the percentage of black people in prison. So it's not any, it's probably slightly over, but it's right on par with roughly the number of percentage of black people we have in prison. When we look at how they actually got there, with regards to how they landed in prison, 77% of them were convicted by juries, meaning that a jury said, you did this, and then something later, science, whatever, proved they didn't do it. 7% were convicted by a judge, and 16% pled guilty. So 16% of the 2,111 folks said, yes, I did it. And then evidence or something along the line says, no, you didn't. The crimes that this is involved, 42% were convicted of homicide. So 42% of these folks that were wrongfully convicted were facing homicide charges, or were in prison on homicide charges. 27% sexual assault charges, including 11% of those which involved child sex abuse, and then other violent crimes in there as well. But the vast majority of them, the more serious offenses, were homicide and sexual assault. DNA science played a part in 17% of our exonerations. In 17% of that roughly 2,111, DNA science is what ultimately secured that person's freedom. The average exoneree spent 9 years in prison. That's the average. There are some that have spent significantly more. One of the cases I was looking at just this morning, a guy in Philadelphia was freed after 40 years. And I couldn't fathom giving up 40 years of life, but 9 years is significant enough. When we look at how these exonerations have played out across time, 2000 is really when things started to take off. And we can see that right now, they happen almost weekly. Almost weekly, there's some profiled case of such and such person being freed from prison after so many years, right? And you can see that on an annual basis, we're over, about 175 is what we average on an annual basis now. In 2000 is really when things took off, came down a little bit, but now they're starting to trend back upwards. Okay? DNA exoneration is not so much, in large part because one of the things that we're starting to do, what we started doing back here rather, when we started developing these DNA database, we started requiring that when you're convicted of a felony, we gather a DNA sample. We also passed a federal act that basically mandates that if DNA evidence is pertinent to this particular case, then we test it now versus waiting 20, 30 years and then discovering that we have the wrong person. So we test it now. So some of why DNA is not like trending as rapidly as some of these other ones is the fact that we have laws and policies in place now where we test DNA science when we have it available. Additionally, we're reaching that threshold point to where some of these older legacy cases that go back into the 80s and 70s and other cases, you have folks that are screaming innocence from all decades. But it becomes a matter of, does the evidence still exist that can prove that you didn't do it? If there was a DNA sample left on a blanket in 1950, but this blanket doesn't exist anymore, we can't test this blanket against your DNA to prove that you weren't the person that left whatever blood stain on this blanket. So there are some people who may allege that DNA science can prove their innocence, but the evidence doesn't exist anymore. Okay? When we look at among crime categories, and our breakdown, say for Caucasian, Black, Hispanic, and other, for all crimes, you can see that African Americans make up the largest proportion of those who have been exonerated. And more specifically, when we look at homicide, sexual assault, that's where you see the largest one. The only one that's different is when we look at child sex abuse. Child sex abuse tends to be overwhelming occasions that are wrongfully convicted for child sex abuse. But among the other ones, you can see the pattern is overwhelmingly that African Americans are the ones who are wrongfully convicted. When we look at some of the contributing factors, what plays a part in these different cases, this is of the cases that the 2,111, perjury and false accusations, coupled with official misconduct. And these are not mutually exclusive, meaning that you can have a case where you can have all 5 of these things in play, or you can have a case where it was one of these things that came into play, all right? But essentially, mistaken identity, you can see that roughly 30% of those cases, 30% of the cases involve some element of that. Perjury and false accusations was the greatest one, and official misconduct. Official misconduct is basically, again, a police officer, prosecutor, judge, someone in the system basically abuses the power that they have. And this power may be used either in suppressing evidence or the ways in which police gather things or planting evidence. So there's a number of different ways in which that comes into play. When we think about some additional things on the causes, all right, when we look at very specific crimes, child sex abuse and homicide, perjury and false accusations tend to be the greatest culprits in terms of why those wrongful convictions tend to happen. So in 84% of sexual abuse cases and 68% of homicide cases, perjury and false accusations were the biggest ones. In homicide cases, official misconduct, and this goes back to the fact that with homicides tend to be very high-profile cases. Prosecutors don't want to lose homicide cases, right? And so sometimes they don't want to lose by any means necessary, and if by any means necessary may cause them to do some things that are illegal and cause them to do some things that may, upon further inspection, either get the case overturned or get this person freed because we discovered that we convicted the wrong person. Mistaken identifications are greatest in sexual assault cases. 69% of the cases involve that. False or misleading forensic science, sexual assault and homicide cases, or that tends to be the highest. And false confessions tends to be the highest in homicide cases. Just to give you an idea of, like, again, the nature of what causes the wrongful convictions by the different categories of offense.
Dr. Noble, in the book, by Dr. Y.T. Walker, in 1961 in Albany, Georgia, more people went to jail in the civil rights movement than any other city. That the slogan was born, "We'll fill the jail." And the sheriff opened up all the surrounding jails in that city. This is around 1961, and I'm wondering if you have come across that book or that 60 way to know of that, because there is a spirit and a willingness to go to jail, and I'm of the persuasion that a lot of African American males have personalized nonviolent civil disobedience from independent or personal gain. But I'm not sure if you were in the know of that.
No, I have not read that. In the context of this class, that particular book hasn't been relevant for me right now, but I can talk to you about that afterwards if we need to. I want to give some additional information about DNA exonerations. Because DNA exonerations have been pretty pivotal in securing freedom for a lot of folks. Our first one happened in 1989. Since 1989, we've had 351 people who have been released from prison based on DNA science. All right, and it's not necessarily the case that this is only happening in Texas, although Texas is a huge culprit. DNA exonerations have been won in 37 different states, so this happens all across the country. We also know that, and this is the one that really gets some folks, 20 of these people were on death row, meaning that we potentially could have killed them. And we have killed innocent people, right? But 20 of the folks in these 351 were sitting on death row, and then DNA science said, you didn't do what we thought you did. The average length of time for our DNA exonerees, and again, you got to think about, for DNA to be a pivotal point in the case, it had to be a pretty serious case. So most of these are going to be homicide or murder, homicide or sexual assault. The average person has spent 14 years in prison. And 14 years is a very lengthy amount of time, especially considering that the average person was 27 when they went in. So think about giving up from age 27 to 41. And I ask my class all the time to think about what they're giving up in that time period. You know, age 27 to 41, that's some pretty pivotal time in terms of family development, career development, and those sorts of things. Although most of them don't plan to marry to their 50s, so that doesn't come into their equation yet. The 38 of these, again, DNA exonerees pled guilty, which again, they said they did something that they didn't do, that DNA science proves they didn't do. And again, you have to weigh the fact that a plea bargain rather, is I'm taking the best deal on the table. And if one of my options involves death or life without parole, all right, I'm taking the best deal on the table. Of these 351 exonerees that were cleared by DNA science, 217 of them were African American. So well over half of them were black. 106 were white, 26 were Latino, and I believe there were 2 Asian Americans. So we do have an overrepresentation of minorities among those who have been exonerated via DNA science. When we look more specifically at our DNA cases, all right, we have some leading culprits in terms of what tends to play a part in convicting folks in our DNA cases. In our DNA cases, some of our leading causes, 71% of our cases where someone has been exonerated, in 71% of those cases, eyewitness identification was involved. Again, it goes back to this notion that it's not as foolproof as we may think, all right, especially when you factor in cross-racial emotions and all these other things and police lineup practices and so forth. We also know that 41% of these cases involve cross-racial identifications. Again, what we talked about. I'm not Denzel Washington, but people keep telling me I look like Denzel Washington, right? 32% of the cases involve multiple misidentifications of the same person, which means that more than one person said, yes, that's him, or yes, that's her. In 27% of these cases, it was misidentification through some composite sketch. Go back to the Susan Smith story of how we had a composite that we put together based on Susan Smith's description. Had we actually gone out and again found someone who just closely resembled it, that would have been one of these. Misidentification through a sketch of some sort. In our DNA cases, 45% involve a misapplication of forensic science. Again, one of the biggest reasons I tell people to push for private attorney, because if you have the resources for a private attorney, you probably also have the resources to have whatever DNA evidence tested in an independent lab, and not the state lab. The same state that pays the lab salary, pays the prosecutor's salary, pays the police officer's salary, looks like a conflict of interest to me. So in some cases, you may actually get some cooked evidence, where they may actually give evidence that basically bolsters the prosecutor's case in hopes that you'll never figure it out. 28% involve false confessions. In these false confessions, 52% of the confessors were 21 years or younger at the time of their arrest. Basically kids who may not be old enough or wise enough to understand or withstand the psychological games, the deprivation games that the police may play during the interrogation process. We have subsequently in most of our jurisdictions, most of our large metropolitan jurisdictions have put things in place to fix this. What's one thing that we do? Separate them from others, but we also require that confessions any interrogation has to be recorded. Police interrogations in most major metropolitan jurisdictions now have to be video recorded for the sole purpose of making sure that we can go back and analyze what all went into securing this conviction. Make sure this person physically harmed or beaten into this confession. They were through some aspect of deprivation, put into a state where they signed this confession and so forth. 35% of the false confessions were 18 years or younger at the time of the arrest. Getting even younger. Again, these are kids. 10% of these false confessions have mental health or mental capacity issues. 17% involved informants, or AKA snitches, as we referenced earlier. One of the beautiful things about DNA science is not only can it help us to free someone who's been wrongfully convicted, it can also help us do what? Find the person who actually did it. So in terms of true offenders, in 150 of the 351 cases, DNA science told us we didn't have this, we had the wrong person, and this is the culprit. This is the true culprit. So with these national DNA database now, we can run things years, decades after a case has been closed and actually identify the true perpetrator. Unfortunately, in these 150 cases where we had someone sitting in prison for a crime that they didn't do, the true perpetrators, all right, the true perpetrators went on to commit 147 additional violent crimes, which included 77 sexual assaults, 35 murders, and 35 other violent crimes, which means that, and this all happened while an innocent person sat behind bars for this true person's earlier offenses. So had we caught the true perpetrator, we could have staved off, potentially, because we don't know what else would have happened, but at least of those 150 folks, those 150 people went on to commit 77 additional sexual assaults, 35 additional murders, and 35 additional violent crimes. So DNA science is very powerful. We have put some things in place to start to fix some of this, to fix this issue with regards to wrongful convictions. Part of our solution has been legislative changes. Legislatively, we know that in 2001, we had the Innocence Protection Act that was signed into law. This law basically proposed a comprehensive package of criminal justice reforms that were all aimed at reducing the risk that we may execute an innocent person. The bill called for all offenders basically have the opportunity to prove their innocence through DNA testing. So if DNA evidence is pertinent to the case in some way, shape, or fashion, we have to test that now. And so the DNA portion of that graph that I showed you previously should continue to go down because we're doing a better job of making sure we test stuff now. It also helps states to provide competent legal services at every stage of death penalty cases. So anytime you're convicted of a death penalty or capital punishment offense, you have a slew of attorneys on the state side as well as on the federal side. It also enables those who can prove their innocence to recover some measure of compensation for unjust incarcerations. So, and this varies from state to state, and I'll show you on the very last slide just some of the diversity in how states compensate people who have been wrongfully convicted of crimes. Another step as far as towards a solution has been the development of what's called conviction integrity units. Conviction integrity units, they're essentially offices within prosecutors' offices or a special unit within a prosecutor's office that goes back and basically reevaluates all of their previous cases. All right? These conviction integrity units are relatively new. However, to date, I believe we have 29 of them currently in the U.S. That's the last one, the last count that we had. We have 29 conviction integrity units. These 29 conviction integrity units are responsible for 225 of the 2,111 cases that we know of that involve wrongful convictions. 225 of those were secured out of the prosecutor's office through these conviction integrity units, where they went back and reevaluated their old cases and discovered we got the wrong person. Almost 85% of these, however, are in just 4 cities: Dallas, Houston, Brooklyn, and Chicago. They account for 85% of the 225 that we've secured through conviction integrity units. Houston, Texas is horrendous. Of the 225, over half of them came from Houston, Texas alone. 128 of the 225 from the conviction integrity unit came out of Houston. When we look at so conviction integrity units, so we've had legislative changes, we've had things like the conviction integrity units. Across time, our first conviction integrity unit popped up in 2003. And so we can see that that's when we had our first one, and this is kind of showing you the growth. And the trend is that as more and more prosecutors' offices, in part because we're starting to get a lot more diversity in some of our prosecutors in some of our major cities, and as we get more diversity in some of our major cities, you have folks who understand and get the concept that we don't always get it right. And when folks understand and get the concept that we don't always get it right, in part because they may fit the demographic of some of these folks that have been wrongfully convicted, they open up these units. When we open up these units, we go back and realize we confirm that we haven't necessarily always gotten it right. When we look at the number of convictions that these conviction integrity units have secured, that's also been on an upward trend. So based on that trend, we would expect that, over the next 5-10 years, we should continue to see more and more, as we have more and more prosecutors' offices and more jurisdictions, basically validate and substantiate why they have these units, because they keep finding errors and issues. We'll start to have more of them, and we'll start to see more and more cases of wrongful convictions overturned. We also have, as part of the solution, we have some think tanks that do a whole lot of work in this area. Two of the biggest ones that we have that have really played a huge part are the Innocence Project. The Innocence Project started in 1992. They're based out of New York. A large proportion of our DNA cases, DNA exoneration cases, have been secured through the Innocence Project. They do a great deal of work in this area. And essentially what happens is, as an inmate, I may write to the Innocence Project and say, hey, I really want you guys to take on my case, and I give them all of the information they need about my case, and then they have a board and they make a decision about which cases they will take on. And they take these cases on pro bono. It's a group of attorneys, a group of all sorts of different folks, but they take them on pro bono. And so if you are, this is, a few people have asked me how they can get involved. If you are, I give to the Innocence Project, because the money that they need to test DNA, they got to pay for that. So I'll give an annual donation to the Innocence Project. Much like the Center for Wrongful Convictions does a similar thing. They were founded in 1998. But again, these are two organizations or think tanks that have a great deal of resources that take on cases that offenders know about, that will write them, and they have a system or grid of sorts in terms of how they determine what cases they will take on. The evidence has to still be in existence and all sorts of things for them to take on the case, but a large proportion of our wrongful convictions have been won largely by these two groups. Lastly, I want to talk about compensation. And just out of curiosity, because I posed this question for the first time to my class this semester. I asked the class, how much is a year of your freedom worth? How much is a year of your freedom worth?
And what would the answer?
Well, I'm asking you right now, because I want to see how your answer compares to their answers. I think you may.
Invaluable.
Invaluable? Anybody got a number for how much a year of your freedom is worth? If we told you that for 1 year, we're going to put you in prison, and at the end of this year, we're going to give you X amount of dollars. 60,000? 150,000? You're a lot more expensive than the students were. They was like 60,000, 75. I was like, I need some millions. And what I was trying to explain to them was, and especially somebody was adamant, like the 250,000 was like enough. And I was like, no, well, you got to think about when you get out. If your record wasn't expunged, you're a convicted felon. You're going to run through that. $250,000 is not a lot of money. But in their world, because, again, they're college students, that's like, whoa. And have to explain to them, like, now you have this lifetime of you don't qualify for this, you don't qualify for that, people don't want to hire you, and so what's your quality of life look like once you get out? We do have, currently I believe there are 32 states and the District of Columbus, or DC rather, that offer some form of compensation. 74% of the folks who are exonerated through DNA science did receive some form of compensation. 32 states and DC, which means there's 18 states in this country that if you are wrongfully convicted, they don't even give you a my bad or our bad or an apology of any sort. You just may be released. But Tennessee will get there. We do have compensation packages. However, some of them I will show you are, we have compensation packages, but we make them very difficult to receive. Few examples. In Texas, $80,000 per year and an annuity set aside in the same amount. So $80,000 per year and an annuity set aside in the same amount.
That's a lump sum that you get.
Lump sum.
So during 10 years, 800,000.
Yep. But Texas, again, there's a catch that's going to come up at the end of the last point on here. California is up to $100 per day. Anybody doing that for $100 a day? Iowa is $50 per day plus lost wages up to $25,000 per year plus attorney fees. Anybody taking that one? Still no takers, okay. Virginia, 90% of the per capita personal household income up to 20 years plus tuition assistance at any of their community colleges. Anybody taking that one? Still no takers, all right. Federal government, $50,000 per year if it's a regular case, $100,000 per year if it was a death row case. Unfortunately, many states have built-in clauses to where if you falsely confess or you plead guilty, disqualifies you from receiving compensation. So in some cases, there are these loopholes built in. Okay? Or you have...
I mean, because just all that you told us before, the reasons that people plead guilty in false confessions are often not because they were trying to deceive.
They were basically either beat into it, so yeah, they can be contested. And a lot of times these things get caught up and tied up in the court systems for years before you ever actually see anything, all right? That's our last slide, but I want to answer any questions we have now. I tried to leave us a little bit more time to get in questions today, so we have about 10 minutes for questions.
A man exonerated after being convicted in Memphis, they still held him in jail after he was exonerated and told them 2 months or more for them to do the paperwork and get him out unless he signed the paper saying he did not want the
Compensation. Yeah.
But can't some volunteer group or some law group get that law changed in Tennessee? It's awful.
It's legislatively, yeah, you can get involved and try to get stuff like that changed, but it's difficult. We have multiple levels of bureaucratic red tape and multiple levels of burdens of proof in terms of being able to prove that something was done maliciously in order for folks who have been wrongfully convicted to get any type of compensation. Very few states like to go back and basically pay out millions upon millions of dollars for that.
And how much is Tennessee's compared to?
Ooh, I'd have to go back and look. I don't know those right off the top of my head.
Do you happen to know the status of the backlog of the rape kits in Tennessee?
I don't know that one either. I don't look a whole lot just at Tennessee. I look a lot more nationally and when I teach my class, in part because students come from all over the country, and so I try to give them a glimpse of what stuff may look like in various places. So.
In case of death of the guy that, or the woman that was exonerated, does the wife or the husband, her immediate family, children, get part of this?
They would be the beneficiaries of that.
And so it means that she would get it until when, if he dies?
That's a good question. I'm not exactly sure if it's like how the death benefit applies in terms of is it for 15, 20 years, but if that person dies, they would basically have gotten it based on the term that they were in there. So if they spent 10 years in there, they're getting this lump sum amount for this person's 10 years. It's not like a retirement account of sorts where you're getting a certain payment throughout. You're getting kind of a lump sum payment for the amount of time that this person was there. That's a very good question. In some places they do, and in some states they don't. I actually looked at that this morning. In some states they do, some states they don't. Because that would influence, yeah, especially with the tax rate. And it'd be nice if it was taxed at the rate of taxes at the time during those years. That would be nice as well.
Are there conversation or discussion going on with those through the study that you in reference to the teenagers going to jail in Birmingham in the 60s, and even the bus system? Do you know, when I lived in Atlanta, I'm not prejudiced in saying this, but I just have to show the other side. There were bus drivers recently in Atlanta that lived there who were still punishing whites for what the white bus driver did down in Montgomery in 1955. So I don't know if to me, and forgive me for saying this, but I'm not apologizing. I trace all of this back to the 60s era. And a Morehouse student told me that the civil rights leader used the jail more than anyone else to get rights. And all these things cannot be ignored.
I mean, I would agree with that. I don't study the civil rights era. I think if I was a scholar of the civil rights and civil rights policies and practices, I would be more versed in that. But that's a very specific question dealing with civil rights related issues. He's inquiring about the degree to which folks who were, I guess, arrested as part of the 1960s, and if I understand correctly, that it created this kind of we will fill the jails type mentality that may have some spillover effect in terms of today's youth and how they view going to jail or going to prison.
You were talking about the Conviction Integrity Unit. So there are 29 United States, 29 states, or just 29 units?
29 units.
And who are they responsible for overseeing? Because they're essentially an oversight.
Yeah, they're responsible for overseeing the cases in their particular jurisdiction. So like if it's the one in Harris County, which is Houston, Texas, all of the cases that came out of that jurisdiction, those are the cases that they oversee. And it's a separate unit within the prosecutor's office. So they will report back to the prosecutor's office, which ultimately reports up to the state.
So not every county has one?
No, not every county has one.
Why not?
It's a prosecutorial thing, and it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. If you get a prosecutor who, again, as I was alluding to earlier, I believe in Harris County when they got theirs, they elected a minority prosecutor. And he understood that wrongful convictions happened, so he created the CIU unit.
So who decides whether or not to have that oversight unit?
Prosecutor, governor, these are folks in the upper administration of the state who's going to be responsible for that.
So the person who would be you're overseeing can say, I don't want oversight, then that's it?
Yeah. Or we don't have the resources for it, because it takes money. In a lot of cases, you're paying to basically go back and test evidence, and you got to devote manpower to it. If you don't have the resources, and you just don't want to discover your own buried bones, you don't invest those kind of resources.
Do we have that here
We do not have a CIU unit or a conviction integrity unit in Tennessee.
in Tennessee?
So there, it has never been a state law requiring.
You have your normal like appellate court system and appellate review process, but that's all part of the court system. Like any conviction would naturally go to the appellate court, and the appellate court is typically looking for major constitutional flaws in terms of how your case is processed. And it's going to be a lot more detailed if it's a capital punishment case versus a everyday run-of-the-mill felony versus if it's a capital punishment case. But even still, that's in the court system, and they're not looking for the types of things that may actually come up in a wrongful conviction type case. It's looking at more or less the constitutional procedure where any of your rights violated, that this go as it should have gone according to policies and procedures.
So that's sort of like a polluter telling the EPA, I don't want you to look at me.
Yes. And to me, you'd have to have the right-minded people in multiple places, including the governor of your state and the prosecutor that you elected in whatever jurisdiction, to then want to. You also got to think about, as a prosecutor, you're basically, in some cases, going back and looking at the cases of your predecessor. And this is kind of like a tight-knit group to an extent. And you may come along and discover that this person was real shady. And this happened in Texas, for example. They had a very rogue prosecutor. And the new prosecutor basically started pointing out the flaws in this. And this predecessor's friends, crime lab technicians, police officers, a lot of the same people that you got to rely on to help you with your cases currently. And you're going back and discrediting a lot of what that person said and did. So in some cases, you're basically tying your own hands in some of your future cases. There's a lot of politics involved in these decisions to have and not have these units.
Well, boo-hoo, I'm a physician, and if anything happens, that's going to happen to me by my peers, and I'm going to be asked to do the same for them, whether I did anything wrong or not. It's the outcome that's based upon whether I was at fault of anything or not.
Yeah.
I have to undergo that.
With peer-reviewed research, I undergo it as well. But every industry and every section of our criminal justice system does not have to do that.
Is there any move in Tennessee to require those?
Not that I'm aware of.
Do you have any statistics on red or blue states that have those units?
You said, what are those states?
Red or blue states that have the units?
I haven't broken it down by red or blue, but I can tell you where they are. I have it in a separate place. But.
Years ago, I heard that there was like 5% of the cases were false. And I don't know where that came from. But then I think I heard about 20 years ago, it was an estimate of 5% were false convictions.
That was what that came from. There was research out of Ohio where they surveyed prosecutors, judges, police officers, and what they basically asked them was, based on your best estimate, how many cases in any given year actually result in a wrongful conviction? And when they averaged it all out, it came out to be about 5%. But we don't have a actual statistic, but that was just what was tossed around. And then from that, you can say if 5% are involved in wrongful convictions, and we average about 1 million or so felony convictions a year, that's still a whopping number.
Doesn't it make a difference that only 5% of the cases go to trial? These are only cases that have gone to trial.
No, these are some of these are cases that pled guilty. These are plea bargains. Yeah, these. Mm-hmm.
What would you look for in the criminal justice system to decide on the most just place to live?
That's a very good question. I've never been asked that one.
You don't have to answer.
Well, I can tell you what I'd look for. If that was the sole factor, I would look for multiple levels of diversity. And from a policing perspective, from a prosecutor perspective, just diversity, because diversity of thought, diversity of experience, all of that. But when everybody, this groupthink mentality plays every level, that's not a good thing. I wouldn't want to live at a place like that.
Just a comment, if you look at the National Statistics of the American College of OBGYNs and the National Institute of Health, most sexual assault cases, those women and victims are never offered a rape kit, let alone have it collected, let alone have it processed.
Mm-hmm.
So that ingrained intimidation begins in the emergency room.
And a lot of times the police are involved in that as well.
They're not.
And in some cases, like even at the police officer level, there's a lot of jurisdictions that have required that, one, you have a female officer, and two, that female officer be trained basically in sensitivity, because you can't have a male police officer who doesn't get the concept, basically gathering all the evidence to bolster any type of a rape case. We are good for this week. I will see you guys next week.